Today's theme is, if the other America were being written today, what would we need to write about? I have to admit, as I approached the topic initially and thought we have one day to do this, I had a great deal of trepidation. It seems impossible to do justice to the breadth of experience and causes and situations around America's poor, even though we know that Harrington did it pretty concisely. If we ask the question, who are the invisible poor today, there are so many avenues we could pursue. We could think about whether it's the rural poor, the urban poor, and even the poor in the suburbs, a new topic, often underserved by social services there. Native American reservations was one theme we talked about yesterday that Harrington didn't cover, and we're not going to be able to cover today either. Things like healthcare workers who take care of the elderly and the sick all around the city, working poor who are there but hardly visible to us. Poverty rates may be lower than when Harrington wrote 50 years ago, but it's clear that the distribution of poverty has changed. Thanks to Medicare, Social Security, the elderly are considerably less likely to live below the poverty line than was true when Harrington wrote. But children are not so fortunate. More than a third of American children live in households where the income falls below the poverty line. The decline of industrial America is far advanced compared to when Harrington wrote 50 years ago, what he began to notice. And the opportunities are provided for people of low or moderate technical skills are greatly diminished. The structure of the U.S. economy has changed radically, and there are many more reasons to worry about the creation of a permanent underclass. If we were to write a new version of The Other America today, I know that our speakers today would be among the very best we could ask to start that project. I look forward to learning from them today.
Good morning. I'm Susan Crawford Sullivan from the Department of Sociology and Anthropology here at Holy Cross, and it is my great pleasure to welcome Annette Lareau here. Annette Lareau is the Stanley I. Sheerr Professor of Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, where she teaches courses in sociological fieldwork, sociology of the family, and seminar on rich and poor, which I would be very interested to learn more about, among other courses. Her celebrated book, Unequal Childhoods, looks at the role of social class and family life. For the past 2 years, this book has been the common core required reading among all of the intro sociology classes taught here at Holy Cross. So many of the people in our department and many of our students are familiar with this work. Most recently, a 10th anniversary edition came out of the work of Unequal Childhoods, which goes back and traces the children who she interviewed as 10-year-olds years later, where they're now young adults, some of them in college and some of them not so fortunate, as I imagine she might be speaking more to us about. Dr. Lareau received her PhD at the University of California at Berkeley, and we are very pleased to welcome her here to Holy Cross.
Thank you. Thank you for coming out this morning bright and early. And thanks to Tom Landry for organizing this terrific conference, as well as to the gracious introduction. I have to tell you that when I was in high school, when I was about the age of, a little younger than many of the college students here, I read The Other America, and it had a huge impact on me. It, I would say, rocked my world in a way. I was living in the suburbs, in a prosperous suburbs, and it was highly stratified. And I came from a middle-class family. My parents were both went to college under the GI Bill, but they were a little bit quirky. And so in the stratification system of where we lived, we were clearly at the bottom of this system. And I think that influenced my interest in stratification, but a group of us organized a walk against hunger when we were in high school. And then I think compounded by my classes at University of California, Santa Cruz, and also the general age, I've gone on to have a deep and abiding interest in inequality. Well, today I'm going to share with you the work from my book, Unequal Childhoods, which, as Susan mentioned, has recently been, I've added a second edition. I added 100 pages based on a follow-up study. And I think we've always had a language for race in America, but we haven't had much of a language for social class. Now, the Occupy movement and the widespread use of the 1% and 99% has changed that in many important ways. And yet our knowledge of inequality, I think, remains shallow rather than deep. And in particular, there's a tendency, I think, to focus particularly on the attributes of individuals who were poor. And so we focus often on people's cultural traits sometimes. But in doing so, we neglect the ways in which standards of institutions play a pivotal role in legitimating inequality. And so schools, which are compulsory for young children, children come in, even when they're 4 years old, their mother's education predicts very heavily how many words they know, how many sounds they can sound out, if they can count to 100 or not. And we know that children born to upper middle class parents have a clear advantage in kindergarten and first grade than do children who are born in working class and poor families. These gaps in educational performance are legitimated by schools. And so when we interview adults who are working class or poor, they almost always say, as in Ain't No Making It, it's my fault. I goofed up. I should have worked harder. And yet in doing this, we blind ourselves to the role that institutions play. Institutions are selective and historically specific in what they legitimate. What it means to go to school today is different than what it meant to go to school 50 years ago when Michael Harrington's book was published. And our standards for parent involvement in schooling have changed, as have our standards for medical care. 50 years ago, the notion that doctors were really very powerful and that they treated you was a much more pervasive cultural notion than it is today, when young people and grown-ups are expected to take responsibility for their health care. In medical settings, individuals are expected to be proactive, and doctors like and approve of patients who are more proactive than they do of patients who are more passive. And so in my comments today, I want to talk about the young people as they aged. And I want to highlight the fact that is one predicted really when they were 10 years old. When they were 19 and 20, a full decade later, the patterns that were begun in childhood unfolded even more deeply. And there were no surprises. Now, to be sure, if I was designing the study to study young adults, I would have designed a different study. I would have looked for disconfirming evidence, and I would have looked for young people who were upwardly mobile from working class and poor homes, and middle class families who were downwardly mobile. But I didn't have that luxury in the sense that I wanted to follow up a decade later. And so I was restricted to the young people who I had followed, which I'll tell you about in a second. And so to preview my argument today, I want to argue that there were 3 ways that parents differed in their negotiations with institutions. Middle class parents had much more information about the standards of institution than did working class and poor families, and they had much more specific information than did the working class and poor families. In addition to differences in information, there were differences in intervention. And the working class and poor families had trusted the school, they had depended on the school, and they had turned over responsibility for education to the school. That pattern continued even as their children moved out of high school and sometimes very much wanted to go to college. And there were also differences, of course, in the economic resources that parents brought to the endeavor. And so when children ran into hurdles, as all children did, parents had different levels of information, patterns of intervention, and then economic resources to bring to bear to advance their children's life chances. Now, there were, the sociologists, I think, have, and the American public in general, has focused too much on the aspirations or the transitions to adulthood in terms of outcomes, and they haven't looked enough at the processes. And theoretically, conceptually, I find the concept of cultural capital to be useful here. And not unlike the children's story of Rumpelstiltskin, where an impish creature comes in the middle of the night and spins straw into gold. So upper middle class parents take their children's resources. Some of those children have significant learning disabilities and significant difficulties, but through an aggressive pattern of monitoring and intervening, these parents are able to facilitate their children's success and even go to college, even with low grades and significant learning disabilities. So parents are able to help transmit advantages to their children in their life paths. My research makes it clear that all parents of all social classes wanted the best for their children. They wanted their children to grow and thrive. And working class and poor parents had very scarce resources. They had scarcity of food. They often lived in housing that was inadequate. They had trouble with transportation. As Michael Harrington documented 50 years ago, it had changed in many ways, but there were still profound scarcities. And they sought to give their children their best chances they could. So in my sample, I did not find any differences in how much parents cared about their kids or the level of material sacrifice they showed for them or what they wanted for them. But I did, and also all the children faced challenges, turning points, and dilemmas. And it's not that middle-class children were spared from getting their heart broken or having a friend die in a car crash. It's not as if there weren't very difficult aspects in middle-class children's lives, because there were. But the children had different experiences in institutions, and for the most part, the middle-class children, as we see nationally, were much more successful than the working-class and poor children, particularly in going to college. And as I talk about at the end of my talk, there were also differences in how the young people interacted with the police and the role of the state in surveilling white and black, poor, and working-class youth in this large city. And there was also more heartache and disappointment that the working-class and poor parents encountered compared to the middle class when the children were young adults. So let me tell you a little bit about this study. The study mostly took place between 93 and 95 in a large northeastern city, and though there were also some interviews in a Midwestern town. I got into a public school that was considered to be a good public school. It was predominantly white, but it was almost, most of the white kids were on free lunch. And there was a heavy African-American population. I went to the school. I was there, 2 or 3 times a week for several months, got to know the kids, did interviews with the parents in their home, always brought a pie to the interviews, and wrote a thank you note. And, by the time you write them and call them the night before and a quarter get rescheduled, you get to know the families. And then from there, I asked the families to participate in a more intensive study where we went to visited them, usually every day for 3 weeks. And we tried to cover different kinds of activities. I had a multiracial team. So half of the kids were white, half were black. They were upper middle class, working class, and poor. I also went to a suburban school district. I was there less long, but still about 3 months. Same thing, got to know some parents. They were not sufficient. I was in a predominantly white school, and in some ways it's sort of a parallel to America in general. It was very hard to find a school that was integrated by class and race. And if I had found that school, everyone would have said, it's really unusual. So I faced a dilemma in simply even studying inequality in America. So in the end, I went to a predominantly white school in the suburbs, also considered to be, quote unquote, a good school district. And then I recruited additional black families who were middle class from social networks. And also I had to recruit additional white poor families. There's no doubt that we had an impact when we were there. We noticed that yelling went up and cursing went up. Again on the 3rd day, and again on the 10th day. Normally in ethnography, you stay until you're not learning anything new, and I can't say that that was the case for this. We weren't there really that long. I had an anthropologist working with me who called it hit and run study. I'm like, golly. But she really thought we should have been there a year, but the study was too ambitious in lots of ways, and it's not a role model for a dissertation, certainly. I kept in touch with so I defined class by education and occupational criteria, not by income. Income is more fluctuating. So to be in the middle class, you have to have a college degree, and you have to have a highly credentialed occupation with some level of autonomy, following the work of Melvin Cohn. The working class people were in the labor force, largely full-time. Mostly they were high school dropouts or high school graduates. They could have had some college. And the poor families were not in the labor force in any kind of sustained way. I kept in touch with them. I gave them little presents. I sent $5 with a Christmas card every year. And many of them kept in touch with me, especially when their kids were getting ready to graduate from high school. Right around when the book was published, I went back to them. I gave them a book, and I talked to them. I did interviews with them, sometimes before the book came out, and that sort of unfolded between 2003 and 2005. And as I explained in the book, and we can talk more about it in the question and answer if you want, some of the families were fine about the book, but some of the families had their feelings hurt by the book, and they felt that it made them look bad. All right, so here's the Greeley family who don't appear in the book. And they're a white family. She's a high school graduate. She actually grew up in the suburbs. Her dad was a prosperous man, was like a contractor, construction person. And she had been downwardly mobile, and she had a very bad drug and alcohol problem. And her husband and she were separated, and he had a terrible problem as well. And her mother had died when she was young. She didn't have any sisters. And when her problem was so severe, the state came and took her children away. So her children had been in foster care. She had recently gotten them back when they were 10. She'd had them less than 2 years. And she had 3 children, the eldest of whom was Carl, who we followed. So a decade later, we come back to them. Carl has dropped out of high school. He's working. He's working on a graveyard shift, stocking groceries in the shelves. And he says he wants to go back to school to, quote unquote, be in computers. And in his account and his mother's account, they agreed that he did not like school. He did not want to go to school. And Ms. Greeley was agitated about her powerlessness in the situation. So she said, I called the school. And I asked him, I said, my son doesn't want to come to school. What legally can I do? And there's nothing I can do when he's 17. If he don't want to go, he don't have to go. It's that simple. They can quit, and when they're 16, but you have to have the parents' permission, and he has to have a job. But you know, he just didn't go to school the last month, and he was 17. There was nothing I could have made him do. Ms. Greeley had a tale of inadequacy and inadequate response on the part of school officials to her children's needs. She described being assigned to a middle school by the school counselor. He said it'd be a great school for him. It's smaller. No one has issues. No one has problems. And she was upset to learn later that it was an overwhelmingly black school and there were only a handful of white kids in it. She felt this counselor should have told her this information. She said that her kids had high test scores. She said Pammy was 140 IQ and Rick was 140, but none of them did nothing with it. I just think because of the circumstances, they just didn't flourish. And I think if the schools were different, they had different opportunities to go to better schools, but they didn't. And unfortunately, when you're poor, you have to go to the neighborhood school. There was just no choice of them going anywhere else. You have to go to the neighborhood school. Ms. Greeley and her son agreed that Ms. Greeley had adamantly pressured her son to continue to go to high school, but ultimately saw that he was grown and that there was nothing she could do. Harold McAllister, an African-American young man who grew up with his mom, his dad, and his mom were never married, but his dad was in his life. They were both high school graduates. His dad worked as a mechanic. And his dad had passed away. His dad was much older. His dad was like 20 years older than his mom and had grown kids in the 30s when he was 10. He had a sister his age. He had 2 older sibs. He had many cousins that were always in and out. And he had been assigned to a magnet charter on the basis of his test scores. And he was in a college-bound work in 9th grade. So as he says, so I was cool. The magnet was just like in math and science. That was their subjects, and I was cool with that, but my attendance wasn't that good. So then he explains. He said, they kind of kicked me out of the charter and put me in another charter. The other charter, the work was easier. So I started, you know how you start chilling more. So if I'd stayed at the magnet, I would have been cool. The work was harder, but it was like on my pace. It gave me a challenge. One of the drawbacks of the follow-up study is that I only have the interviews with the kids. I don't have the school observations at the school. So it was not completely clear to me why he was transferred out of this program. But it was clear it was on the first day of his sophomore year. And it was something to do with his attendance, he thought, and possibly that he had gotten a low grade in English. His parents did not know about it. They were not informed, and they had had a history of depending on the school. The school was, after all, staffed with people who had college degrees, while they only had high school degrees, and they depended on the educators to educate their children. Harold was a very avid basketball player, and he ran into trouble with the coach. And he looked like a football player. He was kind of broad shoulders, 5'11", 240 pounds, big guy. But he was actually quick on his feet in basketball, loved basketball, and he was a better basketball player than our field worker was when he was 10 years old. And our field worker thought he was a pretty good basketball player. So he gets to high school. He tries out for the team. He doesn't make it. Harold's view is that the same guy was the coach for football and basketball, and the coach didn't like him, and the coach wanted him to play football because, as he said, the football team stunk. Harold said he had had knee problems. He said, I don't play football. So this debate went on, and he refused to try out for the football team. And although in this particular city people are ranked by basketball in an informal mechanism, and he was ranked very highly on this system, he ended up not being on the basketball team at the high school. So he pleaded with his father to transfer to another high school. So I asked him, I said, what was involved in transferring? Paperwork, because I had like a couple players on their basketball team. I played with them in city leagues. I've never been a problem child. My grades were average or above average, so what was the reason for them not to let me transfer there? And I said, and when did you talk to your dad about it? Like some nights after I have a basketball game, we'd win easily, like us all playing together. And I'm like, hey, we can do this in high school too. He used to say something, but I knew he didn't really care about basketball. Like he never played basketball. He was boxing, and that was it. And I said, did you talk about it with anyone else at the time? And he talked to the principal, and he asked the principal to intervene on his behalf. But the principal said that she couldn't, and she said it was up to the coach. And I said, what about your mom? He said, my mom sometimes, I just felt the vibe. I don't know how to say it, though. I talked to my mom a lot, but not a lot, but sometimes, but nothing ever happened. His family had a series of inadequate housed apartments. There were, one time the rain fell through, the apartments weren't kept up, and they moved many times in his high school career. And finally, he began living with his dad, who was across town, who was actually closer to the high school. And when this basketball thing happened, he was very, very, very distressed. And so he said he finally got a job to take his mind off basketball. Well, the job he had to take he still has that job. It's like in a restaurant like TGIF. And at least last I heard from him, he was in that job. And it took him 2 hours to get there, and he had to change buses 4 times to get this. They usually got a ride back. So he began working, 4 to 12, first as a busboy. And he said that his mom would always wake him up and say, go to school. But his dad, didn't wake him up as much. He got in at midnight. He started going to bed late, and he started going to school less. And so 2 months before graduation at Easter, about this time of year, he dropped out. His mother was livid, as she explained to me. He had a nice time there. He was progressing good. But he didn't play sports in school. He played sports out of school. But when we moved in April, he had 2 more months of school and graduate, and Harold didn't graduate. I was mad. All he had to do was graduate. 2 months, April, May, June. She was furious. But she and he agreed that it was up to him that he was grown. And she was informed of it. She was extremely disappointed, but she was powerless in this situation, that he was an adult. So this notion that kids were an adult when they were 17, 18 was one that was very pervasive in the working class and poor families. And in the book, I describe another case of Wendy Driver, a white working class girl, and her mother really wanted to go to college. She went to a Catholic college, Catholic high school. She applied to a Catholic college. She got into the college. She was planning to go. But on very basic things, the parents didn't know. For example, the father thought if you applied and you didn't get in, you got your money back. And also there was a misunderstanding. They didn't, they went in the fall, they went for a visit, and the lady said, oh, we'll look forward to seeing you in a couple months. And the mother misunderstood that and thought that she'd been accepted. And so she went down, she said she's been accepted. And they're like, what? And they said, she said she was accepted. And she didn't understand that you can come in the fall, you here in the spring, the whole calendar was, and she'd never gone to college. It was very reasonable that she would not know this information. And so this idea, and then later, Wendy went to community college, and she thought about taking she had learning disabled, she wanted to take a class, and they wanted her to go in a remedial class where she wouldn't have gotten credit, and she wanted to go in a class that had credit, and she was really mad about it, and they weren't flexible. So I asked her, I said, did you think about talking to your parents about this? And she looked at me like I had three heads, like, why would I do that? There's nothing they could do that would be different than I could do. And she said, I'm grown. This idea that young adults were grown was not something we found in the middle-class families. There, when the children were exactly the same age, there was a pattern of dependence on the pattern of the young people and their parents. And so I'm going to focus on two of the boys here. I'm focusing on the boys, especially because I want to talk about the police and all the kids. The issue of police was more salient with boys than girls. So Alexander Williams, African-American family, father was a judge, high-price, fancy lawyer. Didn't mean to say that. He had a promotion. And mother, high-level manager, travels a lot for work. Only child, very elite private school. And he had a series of very busy, organized activities. She really didn't want him to watch TV, so in the book I described he was getting up at 8 in the morning, going to piano lessons, running around like crazy. This continued through middle school and high school. He developed an interest in pre-med. He was in a series of very elaborate math and science camps, and some of which were particularly aimed for minority kids. She hired a SAT tutor for him. He practiced for the SAT. And she had the number of his high school teacher's counselor in her cell phone because she called the teacher so often. And he had combined SAT scores of 1350 under the old system. He applied early decision to a school similar to Columbia, an Ivy League school, which had an unusual program where you're admitted to medical school at the same time that you're admitted to college. He applied early decision. He was admitted. He was set. His mother continued to monitor his schooling. For example, she helped him sign up for summer school courses. She looked up the courses. She found out what times they were. She helped him get enrolled in it so that he could take some classes in the summer. She helped him get internships, and she introduced him to some of her friends. She was monitoring in this ongoing way his progress. This was also true with the other middle-class kids, but I want to talk a little bit more detail about Garrett Tallinger. Now, Garrett Tallinger is a white family. They both the parents went to Ivy League schools. They lived in a leafy cul-de-sac. He was the oldest child of 3 boys. Very athletic. And he was very involved in soccer when he was 10. But for various complicated reasons, they moved 1,000 miles away. Where they went, the basketball and soccer schedule at the same time. His father said the soccer team was run by a bunch of knuckleheads. His father had always adored basketball. He was good at basketball, so gradually soccer sort of faded away, and he became more focused on basketball. He was a very talented basketball player and played on the high school basketball team. He was offered a full-fledged scholarship to a school similar to Villanova. He also could have gotten into schools similar to Penn or Yale or Princeton. But there was a gap in the financial aid, and the parents would have had to pay at least $10,000 a year. They had 3 kids. The dad said we were, quote unquote, in the unwashed middle class. They couldn't afford it. They figured Villanova was a better basketball school. It was a complete free ride. He went to Villanova. So, but what's interesting is that every step, the parents oversaw his schooling. So before they even moved there, she toured the school. The mother says, "I was appalled. I visited the school. It's ugly. It's far away. I asked how many kids get recruited for Division I, and they were probably wondering, who is this Northern Hussy coming in and asking these questions? They couldn't tell me where their schools went. They mostly went to in-state schools." And I said, "How many kids go to the Ivies? How many go to Stanford, MIT?" She also encouraged him to take the quote-unquote most rigorous courses. He had never tested well, always had very high grades, never very much of a test taker. So she said, in talking to the guidance people, "I think he's capable of honors. Obviously, you all need to decide." Very common strategy for upper middle class parents. She's not coming in demanding that he get honors, right? She's saying, you need to decide, but I think he's capable of honors, right? So this manipulation weaving their way through. She was very well informed about the standards for college. She said, "One thing I did know was that the more competitive college looks at what's available in high school, and if you're not taking the most rigorous courses of what's available, that's a strike against you in terms of evaluating your manuscript." And so I wanted Garrett, as true with all my kids, I wanted them taking the most rigorous courses they could possibly take. This is very detailed knowledge to have about institutional standards for applying to college. She also insisted, she went in, she said math, AP Calculus, and AP English were at the same time, and she's like, "Come on, guys, you got to get this together. I can't be the only one having this problem." And so they ended up having changed. There was also a supervision of Garrett's budding athletic career. He was their eldest kid. The father described trying to learn how you go. He said, "You send this marketing packets to schools. There's a lot of recruiting websites out there." He said, "All the schools send you letters. So the first thing, you respond to the letter because you're trying to measure interest. See, what's happening is both sides are playing the game. The schools tell you they have a priority list of kids they want. They do their best not to tell you where you are on the list. They want every kid to think he or she is number one. And we do the same on our end." I mean, our strategy was to never tell a school he wasn't interested, because they start talking to each other. So if you tell a school of a certain kind, "I don't want to go there," they say to other schools, "Well, don't bother to recruit him." So this was ongoing process. And in addition to his parents' knowledge, Garrett had a lot of detailed knowledge. He said, "I was really worried at the time because my SAT scores, I was trying to get into Stanford, and it was like 1190. I mean, they did accept a kid with 1140, but still, if you're trying to get into Stanford, that's where I really wanted 1200 really bad. I mean, and then coming here, like to Villanova, their standard's not as high." So what's interesting is that the parents critically evaluated Garrett's strengths and weaknesses. There was the working class parents who wanted their kids to go to college. They're like, go to college, you can do it. They were with sort of boundless enthusiasm, pressuring them and pushing them for it. But the middle class parents assessed their children with a critical eye. So here's Garrett Tallinger. "Well, I think Garrett would have done okay academically at Princeton, but I think Villanova's a better fit. Garrett's a good student, but he's not a brilliant kid. So he would have gotten by at Princeton, where at Villanova, he got the academic award, and he's on the basketball team. He has the highest GPA on the basketball team. He's been selected to the Student Athletic Academic Committee. He was selected to represent Villanova, just not the whole basketball team, the whole universities. So these kinds of opportunities he wouldn't have gotten at Princeton. Now, obviously, Princeton's got other academic opportunities, and Villanova doesn't by far, but I think Villanova's a better fit." And similarly, Stacy Marshall, an African-American family, was deeply worried because her daughter had a C in biology. Her daughter told me and told everyone that she wanted to be a pediatrician. The mother was watching this pretty closely, thinking privately, C in biology is not good for pre-med. But she didn't want to squash her kids' hopes, as she had seen one of her uncles do with a cousin. So she was like keeping her counsel, but watching this. But she did counsel her about the sequence of the course and not to take calculus and don't let your GPA get too low. She was helping her choose her courses. And so this, again, we saw parents critically assessing their children, very specific information about academic standards in high schools and colleges, coaching their children at every step of the way. In fact, I've noticed in my daily life, if I run into other friends, I say, how you doing? They'll say, oh, we are applying to college, right? Now, last I checked, it's only the student who's applying to college. But the mothers especially, this becomes a whole family enterprise. So unlike Harold McAllister, Garrett Tallinger was blessed with parents who were energetically involved in his schooling and his athletic career. And so there were times where Mr. Tallinger even intervened about playing time. He said, well, I normally don't do it, but I did because they were playing a lot of juniors to be, and I was saying, because he was a senior, that's fine, but you have kids, and Garrett isn't the only one. This is their last shot. And if they don't get this summer, then it's over, because they were juniors, they were rising seniors. And the whole point of the AAU Summer League seems to get the kids seen by college coaches. So that's why I didn't understand. Why would you play these young kids when you got kids who wanted and needed scholarships sitting on the bench? I guess they kind of listened. His playing time went up some. And he has other ways about intervening. And then also, finally, they intervened with Garrett about his career choices. So there he was. He said he thought he'd like to be a teacher. And Mrs. Tallinger's reporting this. I guess some point in his freshman year, Garrett wasn't so sure he wanted to continue to major in business or stay in the business school. He was thinking he wanted to be a math teacher or major in education. And we said, okay, that's fine. And Don, of course, again being more pragmatic, said, if that's all you want to earn for the rest of your life as a teacher, but give yourself the most options when you come out of school. Anyway, so sort of on his own, he came to the decision that he's going to stay in the business school and sort of shift emphasis to marketing. So notice the parents say it was his decision, right? And that was very common when kids were little and kids were like choosing organizing activities. Said, don't do it unless you want to do it. It's your decision, right? But as they were sort of saying, well, you might want to do this. You don't want to be left out. Other people are going to be doing it, But I don't want you to do it unless you want to do it. It's your decision, right? So the parents in these cases had very detailed information. They intervened early and often. They didn't always activate every ounce of capital in their formidable repertoire. Sometimes they didn't intervene. But the point that they were complying and sometimes exceeding the standards of schools is what's crucial. And schools will tell you they want parent involvement. What do parents who, quote unquote, value education engage in parent involvement? And really what teachers want is deferential parents who do everything and comply with what everything teachers want. But the point is that even though parents are sometimes harassing teachers and complaining about teachers and asking grades to be changed in an increasingly aggressive fashion, teachers still valorize these parents. And Harold McAllister's parents, who in the end actually have more respect for the notion of professional expertise than the middle-class parents, are dismissed as not valuing schooling. So when the kids grew to adulthoods, I want to sort of talk about one other institution that they confronted, and that was the police. Now, Garrett Tallinger didn't say anything about the police. Police had generally positive relations, relatively little contact. Other white middle-class people had positive relationships with the police. They'd come help them when they needed them. Alexander Williams, African-American family, his parents had warned him repeatedly that he might encounter problems with the police. They said he should be polite to them, he should be compliant, should not argue with them. He had not had difficulties himself, but he anticipated difficulties as he got older. But what was striking was that the white and the black kids in this large urban area had bitter and very difficult relationships with city police. And so Carl Greeley, who had dropped out of high school, said he was just sitting on the street, small houses, a lot of street time, small houses, little privacy, every word you can hear in the whole house. He said, I was sitting there by myself and sitting there waiting for some people to come out, and they come up, grabbed me, threw me against the wall. And he was 16. They arrested him for having some marijuana on him. And then a week later, 2 cops did the same thing. I didn't have nothing on me, though. So they see me, they did it again. He said, man, from the run-ins I have, I don't like them. Like, I got locked up. They were quick to do it. My mom got jumped. They did absolutely nothing. But they were quick to lock me up for 2 little bags of weed. But my mom got jumped, and they didn't do nothing. Billy Yanelli, a white working-class youth who was working as a house painter, also dropped out of high school, said, I mean, these kids around here are bad. Half of them aren't going anywhere. Still, he was insistent that inequity and corruption were interwoven with police work in the neighborhood. In an extremely serious tone, he said, they're crooked. I never committed any crimes. Half of us didn't. But we get locked up because the cops don't like us around here. It's a fact. They love locking us up. The African-American youth also had difficulty with the police. Harold McAllister reported being in the car with a girl who was white and his buddy who was black, and she had left her wallet on top of the car, and they were just in the parking lot, and the police officer came over, and he immediately said, you okay, miss? And Harold said, he didn't say, here's your wallet. He said, you okay, miss? And he was resigned that there was nothing you could do about it. Tyrek Taylor also had a black working class kid. And Alexander Williams, although it's completely different, he had this experience of being people following him around stores, not knowing he was an Ivy League student. And sometimes he said I would play with them and I would see where the camera was and I would try to stand away, and then somebody would come put something away. But resigned, he said, there's nothing you can do about it. He said, I just ignore it. Okay. So what was striking was that by the time the kids were 19 and 20, their parents, who were working class and poor kids, had gone through some significant heartbreak. They had all hoped and dreamt that their children would do well, that they would go to college, that they would get a great job. I was in the house of Billy Yanelli when he was 10 years old, and his father told me he was going to go to college at a school similar to University of Maryland. And he dropped out of high school. So his dad said, it broke my heart. You know, I wasn't expecting that. Tried real hard to get him through, but it didn't happen. It was hard. Tried to get him to do his homework, couldn't get that out of him. I felt bad, but it's just the way it came. What are you going to do? What was interesting, that his notion of the higher education system was more truncated than many other people's notion. And for him, he said, you know, I really wanted him to go to college, get a degree, but he got a GED. And with tears in his eyes, he told me how proud he was that he got a GED. So for him, there was not that big a difference between a GED and a college diploma. Other people echoed this view. I interviewed the brother of Tara Carroll, who was an African-American, poor family. He went to a proprietary school, paid $5,000, didn't end up getting anything out of it, ruined his credit rating in computers, was working stocking grocery shelves and then got a really good union job unloading alcohol on the graveyard shift. He said, you know, stripped off his shirt, sprayed with bug spray, and worked there, you know, unloading boxes all night, and had benefits, good job. And I said, well, how much education? He said, you know, he had a master's degree because he had a year of college after high school. So people's understanding of the very complicated higher education system, the differences between all these colleges, was largely oblique to the families. And Ms. Taylor, African-American working class family, had really pushed him to go to college. He went to community college, didn't go back. I said, how'd you feel? She said, disappointed, as a mother would be. And you feel helpless because you can't really make them. Very difficult to that. You just can't do it. They have to do it on their own. And so, now, it was interesting that the middle-class families, I didn't have very many at all, but Ms. Hanlon appeared to feel publicly humiliated that her daughter didn't go to college, middle-class family. And she'd gotten into a four-year college, but didn't go. And she said, disappointed, but she's got to start making the decisions. I try to support her. She thought about it every day. And so there seems to be more of a public setting when middle-class kids don't go to college than for working class and poor families, but the disappointment was really key. In the book, Hidden Injuries of Class, Sennett and Cobb argue that people absorb their class positions and see it as a badge of ability. And so they see middle-class people as fundamentally better people, more talented, smarter than working class and poor people. The young people in my study were also convinced that middle-class people were better people. And so Billy described a young guy who had been in high school with him, and he said he was in the lunchroom with me every day. He said, quote, he was going nowhere. And then he moved to the suburbs, and he said as soon as he moved, he changed. And I asked him, was there anything different, anything he wished had been different in his childhood? He said, I wished I lived in a different neighborhood, up there, somewhere. He said, they seem like better people than us a bit. I think they have it a lot more easier. They have a lot more easier in terms of life. Now, what Billy does not say is that the standards of institutions are complex. They're historically specific. They change radically every few decades. And our definition of what it means to be a good parent is different today than it was in 1920 or 1940. Our definition of what is a good patient is different than it was in 1890, 1930, and even 1970. So we have to see the standards of institutions that legitimate and feed children into the labor market as historically specific. And we have to see parents as working hard to comply with the standards of these institutions. And in that way, beyond their hopes and dreams for their kids, it's undeniable, in my view, that social class makes a difference. Parents who go to college, parents who have occupational skills and who have stable incomes are able to have more information, they're able to intervene, and then, of course, they have more material resources. Ms. Greeley would have liked to send her kid to a private school. It was out of the question. Ms. McAllister wanted Harold to graduate. She was mad he didn't. But she and her husband, Harold's father, had depended upon the school to manage their son's athletic career in a way that was in his best interest. The Tallengers did not make that assumption. They oversaw the school and supervised the school in crucial ways. And my final point is that just like ice sculpture will melt away on a hot summer day, the young people in my study did not see the efforts their parents had done for them. Instead, they emphasized their own accomplishments. So Alexander Williams said, I know I worked hard. Garrett Tallinger said how much he studied. So their parents' actions in their own social class was largely invisible to them, and so, as in America, they saw their work as a few of individual accomplishments. When the kids were 10, the middle-class kids seemed older. They were exactly the same age, but they seemed bored, hard to impress, looking on spring concert stages like this, looking bored. Well, on the exact same kind of event, the working class and poor kids looked animated, they were smiling, they were like, hi, Mom, they were all excited. 10 years later, that pattern was reversed. The working class and poor kids had cars, payments, some of them had kids, they had jobs they didn't like very much. They were beaten down, they were still hopeful, but they were often resigned. The middle class kids were talking to their parents all the time, calling them for advice when they got lost, asking them how to handle things, excited about traveling, seeing their life ahead of them, but they seemed younger. And they had started their life paths from different points. And in some ways, I think the die is now cast in terms of none of the working class and poor kids are in the professional setting. And I think it's extremely unlikely that that will happen. They're now 28. Alexander Williams is becoming a doctor. Garrett Tallinger now is a high-level administrator. He got engaged. Stacey Marshall got a PhD. She's married, has a baby. And their lives are very different than the lives of the working class and poor. So this issue of how class matters in America needs to be addressed much more directly in the way that Michael Harrington raised it 50 years ago. Thank you.
I'm Susan Rogers. I teach here at Holy Cross. I have a Michael Harrington-inspired sociology of knowledge question about your book itself.
Okay.
As you heard in Susan's introduction, your book is very well known at Holy Cross. It's one of the core readings in all of our Sociology 101 courses. General readers throughout the nation, if they read the New York Times, know your book through David Murray's op-ed pieces. But I wonder...
David Brooks.
David Brooks.
Yeah.
I wonder if your book is also known and used in state teachers' colleges, so that there might be some way of getting your information about how social class works in this country to beyond the elite schools and beyond the readers of the New York Times op-ed page.
Well, I don't know for sure, but I mean, I've been very blessed. Many people have used it, and I do know it is used in education schools, and I often get letters from teachers and even from superintendents and people in the field who are working, who have read it too. So I think sometimes it's used among teachers in actual schools as well.
Hi, my name is Nelson Salazar, and I work for Early Head Start program. And I wonder, in school systems, if you are not native speaker, or if you are working class, and you go to advocate for your child, they look at you as a troublemaker. But if you're middle class, they look at you as you're advocating for your child.
Yeah.
And I wonder, in your study, how much did you see that within the institutions?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, one of the big problems, of course, is that poor people tend to live in big cities. And big city school districts are notoriously complex, bureaucratic, and often underfunded, and some would say dysfunctional. Many, but not all, middle-class people live in suburbs where the school districts tend to be smaller. So I worried a lot about that. And in fact, originally one time I was going to do this whole thing about the different kinds of institutions that the parents are intervening with. And I don't care who you are. You know, it's really hard to get a large, like the New York City public school system, to do things your way, right? But I do think that it is surprising to me how hostile and difficult some of the teachers were to the working class and poor families. I mean, some of them were very good-hearted people and very kind and generous, but some of them weren't. And the parents knew that about their kids. Like, I remember I went by to see Harold. This was after the study was over. He was like in 5th grade. And I said, "Oh, how's your teacher?" And he's like, "I don't like her." He said, she's mean and she lies." And there was sort of a pause. His mother was there. In a middle-class family, you can imagine what would happen, right? She'd be there on the phone. She'd be there the next day. And the mom, there was sort of a pause, and then she said, "Well, what was the name of that other teacher you had in 3rd grade?" And he says, "Mr. Sullivan." No, and the other one. She said, "I liked him." So there was a way, I think, in which the parents and the kids accepted that the school district was unresponsive and unfair in some situations. So there were other times where teachers, like Katie Brindle, got into one of the quote-unquote best high schools in the city. She didn't go because it was too far away, and her mother thought it was too dangerous for her to go that far away, so she didn't go. But it was only because a teacher had filled out the application and helped her do it. And the mother didn't even know about it. So I do think the issue of ESL and lack of responsiveness is a really important problem.
Thank you very much for your talk and for your book. I'm Tina Chen. I'm also from Holy Cross. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit, whether from your research or from your knowledge of the field, about the role of community programs that, like AVID, Upward Bound, Let's Get Ready, Gear Up, that are really trying to support and provide some of that exposure to the hidden capital for students who come from working poor backgrounds?
Yeah, I think there are quite a large number of programs now. And I mean, they still, of course, only get a fraction of the number of poor and working class kids in the country. I think they're often very successful. I do think that it's a rare program that has the energy and investment that a mother has. And so middle-class children often get highly customized actions, you know. And I see that all the time in my social world. You know, I have people, all the research shows people tend to marry people of the same social class. It's gotten greater over time, not less. So you have two people, and often fathers are kind of what I call heavy artillery. You know, it's like the moms are like running the show, but then if something's really bad, then the dads come in, you know, except for math and science, which dads tend to do as kids get older, but not when the kids are little. I found very few fathers who were involved. In fact, I wrote an article that said my wife couldn't tell me who I know, you know, because I didn't, interviewing this dad, and I gave him a list of the names of the kids in the class. And I said, well, you know, if you saw him in the grocery store, who would you know? And he said, my wife couldn't tell me who I know, you know. So he saw his wife's knowledge with interdependent with his. And so I do think that, but I think those programs have had a huge impact on many people. And there are some at Penn as well. You know, a lot of them only accept kids with extremely high test scores. They're often very competitive to get into, like Prep for Prep, for example. But then they say it's a lifelong process, the Prep for Prep family. And so they help to guide people through the process of upward mobility. And I think those tend to be more successful than the ones that are just based in the high school and based on like trying to get into college, because then that first semester can be extremely difficult for working class kids. There's one more last question.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Lawrence Clifford. I fell off bus 19 here in Worcester 65 years ago. During the course of your discussion of your study, you didn't talk too much about discussions with the teachers of these children.
Right.
But in answering the gentleman who asked the second question, then you became more adamant about that. Is that because the system itself just didn't allow you to do that? Is that something that you made a judgment about in organizing your study that you couldn't do, or did it just happen along the way?
Well, to be truthful, what happened was that I did get permission to observe in the classrooms, and I even was able to tape record a number of parent-teacher conferences, which were extremely revealing. But I had made a judgment call to go into a predominantly white school district, which only had three black middle-class families per grade level. That gave me 6 potential families for my study. I was able to interview all 6 of them, but I could not persuade them to be in the intensive study where we followed people around. I tripled the honorarium, which was from $350 to $1,000 in 1994, and they declined. So at the time, it was a heartbreak for me, because I had planned for the book to be organized around schools. But once I lost those 2 kids who were in different schools, then my ability to compare the schools was gone. I already had 2 different schools, which was kind of a problem. I had a big city and suburban, but I was willing to live with that. But once the 2 African-American kids were in other schools, one in public, one private, I lost that ability to compare in that book. My first book, called Home Advantage, looks at parent involvement in schooling. And I actually find that teachers are more similar than they're dissimilar. They all say, I want you to read to your kid. Teachers are mostly lower middle class, many of them are upwardly mobile. So I didn't find that many differences in the standards of the school overall in what teachers were asking from parents. Thank you. Thank you.